The body is divided into several cavities, many of which are fluid-filled and each of which contain specific organs. In this video, we will be looking at the body cavities and the organs contained within each cavity. We will also discuss the serous membranes associated with the ventral body cavity. Several of the fluid-filled body cavities are formed by thin sheets of tissue called serous membranes. Cells of these membranes produce a thin, watery fluid called serous fluid that lubricates organs so they move within the cavity with little friction. Serous membranes are composed of two layers, an outer parietal layer that is attached to the body wall and surrounding structures, and an inner visceral layer that is attached to specific organs. Between the parietal and visceral layers is a thin potential space that contains serous fluid. This potential space is referred to as a cavity. At the top of this image, you see a hand punched into a balloon. This is a common representation of the two layers of a serous membrane. If you can imagine punching your hand into a balloon, the part of the balloon that is directly touching your hand represents the visceral layer of the serous membrane. Whenever you hear the word visceral, you should think organ. So this is the layer of the membrane that covers the outer surface of an organ. The part of the balloon that surrounds your hand but does not directly touch it represents the parietal layer of the membrane. Between the two layers of the balloon, there is an empty space that would represent the cavity. In the body cavities, this space is filled with serous fluid. As you can see in this image, there are two major body cavities, each of which is subdivided into smaller cavities. First, we have the posterior cavity, or the dorsal body cavity. As implied by its name, the posterior body cavity is largely on the posterior side of the body. It contains two smaller cavities, the cranial cavity, which is the area encased by the skull. The cranial cavity contains the brain and a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Next, you can see the vertebral or the spinal cavity, which is the area encased by the vertebrae. It contains the spinal cord and is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The anterior or ventral body cavity is largely on the anterior side of the body. It has two main divisions, the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities, each of which is divided into smaller subcavities. The thoracic cavity is located superior to a muscle called the diaphragm and consists of the area encased by the ribs. Within the thoracic cavity are smaller cavities, the left and the right pleural cavities, and the pericardial cavity. Each of the pleural cavities surrounds one of the lungs. The pleural cavities are located between two layers of a serous membrane called the pleural membrane. The parietal pleura are attached to the body wall and the surface of the diaphragm, and the visceral pleura are attached to the surface of the lungs. Between the two layers, we find a thin layer of serous fluid. The mediastinum is a space between the pleural cavities. It is not a cavity, but it is a space that contains the great vessels that go to and from the heart. It also contains the esophagus, the trachea, the bronchi, as well as other structures. Within the mediastinum is another cavity called the pericardial cavity. It is formed by the pericardium, which is another double-layer serous membrane. The parietal pericardium is attached to surrounding structures in the wall of the pericardial cavity. The inner visceral pericardium is attached to the heart muscle. Between the two layers, we find the pericardial cavity, which is filled with the thin layer of serous fluid. The abdominopelvic cavity is located inferior to the diaphragm and extends into the bony pelvis. There are two subcavities within the abdominopelvic cavity. First is the abdominal cavity. and it is the area superior to the bony pelvis. The abdominal cavity houses many digestive glands and organs. Next, we have the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is housed within the bony pelvis and contains certain sex organs, the urinary bladder, the rectum, and part of the colon. During embryological development, a portion of the original ventral body cavity extending into the abdominopelvic cavity remains intact as the peritoneal cavity, which is a chamber lined by a serous membrane known as the peritoneum. A few organs, such as the kidneys and pancreas, lie between the peritoneal lining and the muscular wall of the abdominal cavity. Those organs are said to be retroperitoneal, or behind the peritoneum. Healthcare professionals refer to four abdominopelvic quadrants formed by a pair of imaginary perpendicular lines that intersect at the umbilicus. This simple method provides for the description of aches, pains, and injuries, and the location can help physicians determine the possible cause. You should know the organs that are present in each of the four quadrants. As you can see from this image, some organs, like the intestines, can be found in all four quadrants. Make sure you are aware of the location of organs that can be found in a specific quadrant. For example, the spleen seen here is only in the left upper quadrant. This little worm-like structure here is the appendix and is only in the right lower quadrant. Anatomists prefer more precise terms to describe the location and orientation of internal organs, so they prefer the method of using 9 abdominopelvic regions rather than the 4 quadrants. Here we can see the 9 different regions. It is important to note the location of organs in these different regions. For example, the spleen is only found in the left hypochondriac region, and the appendix would be in the right iliac or inguinal region.